Hello, and welcome to our quiet space tonight. Let's shed the burdens of the long day, find a comfortable position, and let our minds gently drift. Perhaps you are lying on your soft bed, feeling the weight of your body gradually melting into the mattress. Take a deep breath, feel the fresh air fill your lungs, and then exhale slowly, gently, carrying away all remaining tension. Tonight, we will not travel to distant stars or fairy tale lands. Instead, we will embark on a journey through time, returning to one of the darkest, yet also one of the most profoundly transformative periods in human history. We will experience life in Europe in the mid-14th century, just before and during the time a colossal shadow known as the Black Death enveloped the continent. Don't worry, our story will not focus on horrifying images or shocking details. Instead, we will listen to the story from the perspective of ordinary people, farmers, and artisans. We will feel the rhythm of their lives, listen to the familiar sounds of a medieval village, and witness how they faced an unimaginable challenge. This is a story of loss, but more than that, it is a story of extraordinary endurance, of the ability to adapt, and of the rebirth of society from the ashes. Now, close your eyes. Let this voice guide you, like a gentle river carrying you into sleep. Let the images of the past appear softly in your mind, not as a dry history lesson, but as a vivid dream. We are in Europe in the year 1347, and our journey begins. You have just woken up in Europe in the year 1347. The morning air is fresh and a little chilly as you open your eyes, stretching on your familiar straw mattress. This is not a private bedroom as you know it. You are in a one-room wooden house, along with other members of your family. The walls are made using the wattle and daub technique, a wooden frame plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. It sounds primitive, but it keeps the warmth in quite well, although the thatched roof above sometimes leaks during heavy rains. As you slowly awaken, your sense of smell picks up the familiar scents that have become an inseparable part of life. The lingering smell of smoke from last night's hearth fire, the damp earth rising from the floor, and the distinct odor of human bodies that haven't been washed in a long time. Bathing was not a daily habit in the Middle Ages, but the good news is no one really noticed, because everyone around smelled pretty much the same. Hunger begins to rumble in your stomach. If you're lucky, there might be some bread left over from yesterday, though it may be as hard as a rock by now. You'll soften it by dipping it into some weak ale. That's right, even children drank ale at this time. It was a very light beer, and it was often safer than water, which could make you seriously ill if taken from a contaminated source. The water from the village wells or nearby rivers and streams was often unsanitary, and boiling water was not a common practice. Ale, having gone through the fermentation process, had inadvertently killed most harmful pathogens, making it a safer choice for daily hydration. Your family is not wealthy, but not destitute either. Your father is a free peasant, renting a small plot of land from the local lord, and your family has a dairy cow, a few chickens, and a small vegetable garden. There is enough to eat, as long as the crops don't fail and no disasters strike. Outside your small house, the village has begun to stir. You hear the distant lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens foraging for food, and the calling of neighbors to one another as they begin their daily work. Most people here are peasants, working the fields that belong to the Lord. Some are free tenants like your father, paying rent with a portion of their harvest or with cash. Others are serfs, legally bound to the land and required to perform labor for the Lord several days a week. Life in your medieval village has a certain rhythm, a predictable beat. The days are measured by the rising and setting of the sun. The weeks are measured by the church bell calling you to Sunday service. And the years are measured by the changing of the seasons, by the cycle of planting and harvesting. It is certainly a hard life, full of manual labor and uncertainties, but it is the only life you have ever known. Your life is shaped by a rigid social hierarchy known as feudalism. At the top is the king, who theoretically owns all the land. Below the king are the great nobles, dukes, earls, who are granted vast tracts of land in exchange for loyalty and military service. These great nobles, in turn, subdivide their lands among lesser nobles, knights, and local lords. And at the bottom of this pyramid are the peasants, like your family, who make up the vast majority of the population. The lord of the manor where you live, Sir Robert, resides in a sturdy stone house on a hill overlooking the village. He is not a cruel man, but he is strict and demands absolute respect. He has the right to judge minor disputes in the village, collect taxes, and require serfs to work on his land. Alongside the Lord's power is the power of the Church. The Catholic Church was a colossal force in medieval life, influencing every aspect from the spiritual to the political. The parish priest, Father Thomas, is an important figure in the village. He performs the sacraments, from the baptism of newborns to the last rites for the dying. He hears confessions and grants absolution. The church is the center of community life, not just a place of worship, but also where festivals, village meetings, and even small markets take place. People believe that the only path to heaven is through the church, and they willingly pay the tithe, a tenth of their income, to support this institution. To a child like you, the world seems simple and unchangeable. You know your place in society. You will grow up, marry someone from the village, and probably take over your parents' land, living a life similar to theirs. The idea of social mobility, of a peasant becoming a noble, is almost unimaginable. This order is believed to be ordained by God, and to question it is like questioning the will of the Almighty. Everything has its place, and everyone has their role. This stability, though rigid, provides a sense of security and predictability. You know what is expected of you, and you know what will happen tomorrow, next week, and next year. Your family's work is tied to the seasons. In the spring, your father and the other peasants go out to the fields to plow the land, preparing for the sowing season. This work is arduous, often done with wooden plows pulled by oxen. You and the other children follow behind, picking large stones out of the furrows. After sowing the wheat and barley, everyone prays for moderate rains and favorable weather. Summer is a time for tending the crops, pulling weeds, and mending fences. It is also the time for cutting hay in the common meadows, a vital source of food for the livestock during the winter. Autumn is the busiest season of the year. Harvest time. The whole village goes out to the fields together, using sickles to cut the golden ripe grain. The work lasts from dawn till dusk, under the late summer sun. After the harvest, the grain is threshed to separate the kernels from the stalks. then taken to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour. The Lord takes a portion of the flour as a fee for using the mill. The rest will be your family's main source of food throughout the long winter. Winter is a relatively more idle time. Field work ceases. People spend their time indoors, mending tools, weaving cloth, and telling stories around the hearth. It is also a time of anxiety, hoping that the stored food will last until spring arrives and the cycle begins anew. Your life is not all labor. There are moments of joy and celebration. Church holidays, like Christmas and Easter, are occasions for rest and feasting. There will be special meals with a little meat and sweet cakes. There will be music, as someone in the village plays a flute or a small drum. In the summer, after the harvest is done, the village might hold a small fair, with games, wrestling matches, and perhaps a passing troupe of minstrels. A wedding is also a major event, an occasion for the whole community to celebrate together, to dance and to bless the new couple. These moments, though rare, are precious bright spots in a life that is largely austere and monotonous. They strengthen community bonds, reminding everyone that they are part of a collective, sharing joys and sorrows together. What you do not know, what no one in your small village, or even in all of Europe, can know, is that everything is about to change terribly. A shadow is silently creeping across the continent, a shadow that will transform society in ways that no war or famine has ever done. The first whispers reach your village on the lips of a traveling merchant. He is one of the village's few connections to the outside world, stopping by occasionally to sell salt, ironware, and small luxury items that the villagers cannot make themselves. He brings with him stories of distant lands, of splendid cities and powerful kings. This time, as he stops at the village tavern, he brings a different story, a disturbing one. He tells of a strange disease that has ravaged cities along the trade routes in the Far East. They call it the Great Pestilence, he says, his voice low. It comes from the lands of the Tartars, across the Black Sea. People are dying by the thousands in just a few days. He describes the symptoms vaguely but frighteningly. High fever, delirium, and strange black swellings appearing on the body. Some villagers in the tavern make the sign of the cross and mutter prayers. Others dismiss it, thinking it's just the exaggerated tales of a salesman trying to get attention. After all, alarming rumors often spread faster than the truth, and the world outside the village always seems full of distant and unbelievable dangers. The merchant continues on his journey, and for a while, life in your village goes on as usual. People are busy with the autumn harvest, and the merchant's story is gradually forgotten, submerged in daily worries. But the whispers remain, lingering in the air like a storm cloud on the distant horizon. Occasionally, another traveler passing through brings similar pieces of news, each time a little closer, a little more frightening. They speak of the city of Kaffa in the Crimea, where the besieging Mongol army used catapults to hurl the corpses of plague-ridden soldiers into the city. They speak of the Genoese merchant ships that fled Kaffa, carrying not only goods, but also the deadly pathogen. By the autumn of 1347, the whispers had become shouts of alarm. The disease had truly arrived in Europe. It was no longer a story from a distant land. It had landed in the Mediterranean ports. News spread along pilgrimage and trade routes, from mouth to ear, each telling becoming more horrific. They said that at the port of Messina in Sicily, 12 Genoese merchant ships had docked. When the locals went aboard to welcome them, they were met with a horrific sight. Most of the sailors on board were dead, and the survivors were gravely ill, their bodies covered in strange black tumors that oozed blood and pus. The authorities in Messina hastily ordered these death ships to leave the port, but it was too late. The pathogen had found its way ashore. Perhaps it followed the black rats that scurried off the ships, or the fleas hidden in the hastily unloaded cargo. Within weeks, the disease began to spread throughout Messina, sowing death with unprecedented speed and ferocity. From Messina, it quickly spread to other ports like Genoa and Venice in Italy, and Marseille in France. The port cities, bustling centers of trade and exchange, had unwittingly become wide-open doors for the pandemic to flood into Europe. Hearing this news, a real fear began to creep into your village. Italy and France seemed far away, but everyone knew that the world was connected by the invisible threads of trade and travel. A pilgrim from your village could go to Rome. A wool seller could take his goods to the fairs in Flanders, where he would meet Italian merchants. No place was completely isolated. Your mother, a devout woman, spent more time in the church, praying for the protection of the Virgin Mary and the saints. Your father became quiet and worried, checking the food stores as if a famine were about to strike. No one really knew what they were facing, but instinct told them that something very bad was coming. In the village, people began to prepare as best they could, though no one really knew what they were preparing for. Some stocked up on extra food, fearing that trade would be disrupted. Others resorted to superstition. They hung bunches of garlic and strong-smelling herbs on their doorways, believing that the strong odors could ward off the bad air, or miasma they thought caused the disease. The most prevalent medical theory at the time, based on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, held that disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Another theory suggested that the plague was spread by miasma, or polluted air, rising from decaying organic matter. The village healer, an old woman named Alara, whose knowledge of herbs had been passed down through generations, was busy collecting and preparing her remedies. She prepared poultices from roots, teas from leaves, and fumigants from fragrant resins. She believed that keeping the body balanced and the air pure was the key to fighting off illness. Although these methods had no effect on the plague bacteria, they gave the villagers a sense that they were doing something, that they were not completely helpless against the invisible threat. The village elders met at the church to discuss what to do. Some suggested closing the village to all outsiders, letting no one in and no one out. Others argued that was impossible. The village needed salt from the merchants and a blacksmith to repair their tools. Complete isolation would mean economic collapse. In the end, no decision was made. Life went on, but with an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Whenever a stranger appeared in the village, people looked at them with wary eyes. A cough or a sneeze from a neighbor was enough to cause a flicker of panic. The cozy, trusting community atmosphere began to crack under the weight of fear of an enemy they could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. By the cold months of winter, 1348, The disease had crept deeper into the continent. It was no longer confined to the port cities. It followed the rivers, the trade routes, and the pilgrims, reaching smaller towns and villages. A neighboring village, only half a day's walk from yours, reported several sudden and mysterious deaths. The victims suffered from high fevers, complained of a terrible thirst, and developed strange black swellings in their armpits and groins. Few survived more than 3 days after the first symptoms appeared. The fear in your village was now palpable. It was no longer a distant rumor. It was at the doorstep. Then, one crisp spring morning, as the first flowers began to bloom, a young man named William, who worked at the village mill, did not show up for work. He was a healthy lad, always cheerful and hard-working. When someone went to his house to check, they found him in bed, shaking with a high fever, his body drenched in sweat. His neck was swollen with a hard, painful lump the size of a chicken's egg. His mother was sobbing beside him, trying to cool his forehead with damp cloths. She had tried giving him Alara's herbal teas, but they had no effect. Everyone in the village who heard the news knew what it meant. The plague had arrived. The arrival of the first case sent a wave of panic through the village. Neighbors who had been close to William's family now shunned their house. Some even threw stones at their windows, shouting for them to leave the village, as if driving out the victim's family could drive out the disease itself. Father Thomas, the priest, bravely went to visit William to administer the last rites, but even he kept a certain distance, his face pale with fear. In just 2 days, William's condition worsened. He began to cough up blood, a sign that the disease had spread to his lungs. He was delirious, shouting nonsense, and in the early morning of the 3rd day, he died. William, the strong young man, had become the first victim of the Black Death in your village. What followed was a period of horror unlike anything you could have imagined. The disease spread with terrifying speed. One day, a person was perfectly healthy. The next, they had a fever. And by the 3rd day, they were often dead. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason to it. It struck the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the devout and the sinner alike. After William, the next to fall ill was one of the neighbors who had thrown stones at his house. Then the blacksmith's wife. Then the 2 small children of a serf family. Each day, new names were added to the list of the dead. The black boils, which gave the disease its name, the Black Death, caused indescribable pain. They were called buboes, and were in fact violently swollen lymph nodes. Some victims also developed black or purple spots on their skin from subcutaneous bleeding, known as tokens. When the plague attacked the lungs, it caused another form of the disease, called pneumonic plague. This form was even more dangerous, as it could be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets when coughing or breathing. Those who contracted this form rarely survived more than a day or 2. The collapse of society was swift. Fields were abandoned because those who worked them were either dead, too busy caring for the sick, or too afraid to leave their homes. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The mill wheel stopped turning. The village, once a bustling place with the sounds of life and labor, was now shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of weeping and the mournful tolling of the church bell. At first, the bell tolled for each person who died, but soon There were too many dead to ring the bell for each one. Eventually, the bell fell silent altogether, as if the church itself had surrendered to the ferocity of the pandemic. You and everyone in the 14th century could not know the truth about the enemy you were facing. They came up with countless theories. It is God's punishment for our sins, some said. Groups of self-flagellants, known as the flagellants, traveled from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges until they bled, hoping their painful penance would appease the divine wrath. It is the bad air, others claimed, carrying bouquets of flowers or fragrant herbs, posies, to sniff, believing the pleasant smells could purify the toxic air. It is the alignment of the planets, astrologers declared. A few, in their desperation and search for a scapegoat, blamed minority communities. It is the Jews poisoning the wells, a few muttered darkly, leading to horrific massacres in many parts of Europe. Although your village had no Jewish residents, and such accusations were entirely baseless. The truth, which science would take centuries to discover, lay in a tiny, invisible organism. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This tiny organism lived in the guts of fleas, and these fleas, in turn, lived as parasites on the backs of black rats, Rattus rattus. These rats, stowaways on merchant ships and frequent companions in the crowded, filthy towns and villages of the Middle Ages, had unwittingly become the vehicles for transporting death across continents. When an infected flea bit a human, it would regurgitate the bacteria into the wound. The bacteria would then travel to the nearest lymph node, multiply rapidly, and cause the painful, swollen buboes. This was bubonic plague. If the bacteria entered the bloodstream, it caused septicemic plague. And if it reached the lungs, it caused pneumonic plague, the most contagious form. But you knew none of this. All you knew was that people all around you were dying, and nothing seemed to be able to stop it. This ignorance made the horror all the more profound. Your enemy was invisible, unpredictable, and seemingly omnipotent. It followed no logic you knew. It would strike one person in a family and spare the others. It would sweep through one house and skip the one next door. Its terrible randomness made people feel completely helpless, as if they were just pawns in a cruel game of fate or of an angry god. Fear changed how people treated each other. Social bonds, the very foundation of village life, began to disintegrate. This terror, wrote an Italian writer named Boccaccio about the plague in Florence, was of such a sort that brother forsook brother, uncle his nephew, sister her brother, and oftentimes wife her husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate, as if they had been strangers. These words, though written about a great city, reflected the reality in your small village. People with healthy family members might slam the door on neighbors who came begging for help. Those with sick relatives often found themselves completely ostracized, left to their fate. Some, in desperation, fled. They abandoned their homes, their fields, and even their sick loved ones, hoping that moving to the more remote countryside would protect them from the disease. But often, they only carried the pathogen with them, spreading it to previously safe communities. Others shut themselves in their homes, trying to completely isolate themselves from the outside world. They refused to speak to anyone and only accepted food left on their doorstep. But even these extreme measures were often ineffective. The rats and fleas could easily infiltrate the most well-guarded houses. Your family had been lucky so far. Although the plague raged around you, no one in your family showed any signs of illness, but you lived in constant fear. Every morning you woke up, the first thing you did was look at the faces of your parents and siblings, searching for any sign of fever or fatigue. Every cough or sneeze made your heart clench. You had heard horrific stories of entire families being wiped out in just a few days in neighboring villages, of children being orphaned only to die a few days later, of lovers separated by death just hours after vowing to be together forever. Your luck seemed to be a fragile reprieve, a roll of the dice that couldn't last forever in a world where the Black Death seemed to be winning. Not everyone fled or surrendered to fear. Amidst the chaos and despair, there were still acts of extraordinary courage and compassion. Father Thomas, the village priest, though terrified, continued his work. He went from house to house, administering the last rites to the dying, bringing spiritual comfort to the suffering. He knew that each such contact could be a death sentence for himself, but he believed it was his sacred duty. Many priests across Europe died this way, their mortality rate much higher than that of the general population. Those who stayed and performed their duties became the silent heroes of the pandemic. Ilara, the village healer, also worked tirelessly. Her herbal remedies could not cure the plague, but she could help alleviate the symptoms, reducing fevers with cool teas and soothing the painful swellings with poultices. More importantly, her calm and experienced presence brought comfort to panicked families. She sat by the bedsides of the sick, held their hands, and spoke gentle words of encouragement. She did not have the protection of faith like Father Thomas, only her knowledge of plants and a kind heart. She was also one of the few who seemed immune to the disease, despite constant contact with the sick. The villagers whispered that she was protected by the spirits of the forest. Or perhaps she had made some deal with supernatural forces. And then there were the ordinary people, neighbors who overcame their own fear to help others. A woman whose husband and children had died of the plague, instead of succumbing to grief, dedicated her time to caring for the orphan children in the village. A young man who had lost his entire family volunteered for the horrific task of collecting the bodies and taking them for burial, as no one else was willing to do it. These selfless acts, though small in the context of a global catastrophe, were sparks of humanity in the darkest of times, a reminder that even in the face of death, humans are capable of love and sacrifice. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the plague was the change in how the dead were treated. In normal times, death was a solemn community event. When a person died, the family would wash and dress the body. Neighbors would come to pay their respects, to pray, and to offer condolences. There would be a procession to the church, where the priest would conduct a requiem mass. The body would then be buried in the churchyard, a sacred place in the hope of resurrection on Judgment Day. These rituals were vital, not only to show respect for the deceased, but also to ensure the salvation of their souls. But the plague shattered all of that. With so many dead and the fear of contagion, Solemn funeral rites became impossible. Bodies were often left in houses for days until someone came to collect them. There were no more dignified processions. Instead, rickety carts clattered through the empty streets, piled high with bodies wrapped in simple shrouds. People were no longer buried individually in single graves. The churchyard quickly filled up. Communities were forced to dig huge mass graves on the outskirts of the village or town. The bodies were thrown in, layer upon layer, like lasagna, as one writer grimly described it, with a little earth sprinkled between the layers. For the survivors, this loss was not just emotional. It was a profound spiritual crisis. The inability to bury their loved ones properly, to perform the necessary rituals to ensure their soul's passage to the afterlife, caused immense pain and anxiety. Many believed that the souls of the improperly buried would wander the earth, unable to find peace. The idea of their loved ones being thrown into an unmarked pit with dozens of strangers was an insult to both the living and the dead, another sign that the world had been turned completely upside down. Your family's luck could not last forever. In a world where the Black Death had killed between a third and a half of the population, escaping it entirely was almost impossible. One morning, your younger brother, an 8-year-old boy named Leo, complained of feeling unwell and having a headache. At first, your mother thought it was just a common cold, but by midday, Leo had a high fever. He shivered uncontrollably, despite being covered with multiple blankets. By evening, as your mother was changing his clothes, she found it. A small, hard, painful lump had appeared under Leo's armpit. A silence fell over your family. The fear you had tried to suppress for months had now invaded your home. Your mother cared for Leo day and night. She wiped his feverish brow with cool cloths, trying to get him to drink small sips of water or weak ale. Your father talked about taking him to the nearby monastery, where the monks were said to have experience in treating the sick. But everyone knew that the monasteries were overwhelmed, with many monks having also fallen victim to the plague. Moreover, moving a seriously ill person might only make his condition worse. In the end, your family decided to stay and care for Leo themselves, entrusting his fate to God. Over the next 3 days, Leo's condition worsened. The lump grew larger, turning an angry red, then gradually black. He screamed in pain and delirium. His breathing became shallow and labored. You and your siblings took turns sitting with him, though fear made you want to keep your distance. You told him stories, sang the lullabies he loved, hoping your voice could penetrate his delirium and bring him some comfort. With each passing hour, hope dwindled. Your family prepared for the worst. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. While most plague victims usually worsened and died at this stage, Leo's fever suddenly broke. He stopped shivering. When you called his name, he opened his eyes and looked at you, his eyes weak but lucid. The lump was still there, a frightening object on his small body, but it seemed to have softened somewhat. Over the next few days, something even more miraculous happened. The lump burst and drained pus. It was a disgusting sight, but to your family, it was the most beautiful sign in the world. It was a sign of life. Against all odds, your brother, Leo, was one of the very few who would survive the bubonic plague. His recovery was slow. He was terribly weak, had lost a lot of weight, and the wound from the burst bubo took weeks to heal, leaving an ugly scar. But he was alive. Your family celebrated his recovery as a true miracle, a sign of God's mercy. The neighbors, who had shunned your family, now came by, bringing small gifts of food and congratulations, looking at Leo with awe and reverence. The boy who survived the plague became a symbol of hope in a village drowning in despair. What your family, and no one at the time, could know was why Leo survived while so many others had died. His survival was not entirely due to luck or divine intervention. Modern science would later discover that some individuals in European populations carry a specific genetic mutation called CCR5 delta 32. This mutation alters a protein on the surface of white blood cells, making it more difficult for some pathogens, including the Yersinia pestis bacterium, to invade and hijack the immune system. Your brother most likely carried this protective mutation, a lucky draw in the genetic lottery. The Black Death, in its cruelty, had unwittingly acted as a powerful force of natural selection, increasing the frequency of this mutation among the survivors and their descendants. Strangely, centuries later, scientists would discover that this same CCR5 delta 32 mutation also provides significant protection against another deadly pandemic, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. Like Yersinia pestis, HIV also uses the CCR5 protein to enter human immune cells. People who carry one copy of the delta 32 mutation tend to progress to AIDS more slowly, and the rare individuals who carry two copies, one from each parent, are almost completely immune to most strains of HIV. This means that the Black Death, by selecting for survivors with this genetic trait, had inadvertently helped to protect some of their descendants from a disease that would not appear for more than 600 years. It is a stunning example of how historical events can leave deep and lasting biological imprints on human populations, an echo of the past written in our very DNA. Leo's survival was not just a personal story of luck. It was part of a larger evolutionary story, a chapter in the endless dance between humanity and the microorganisms that both sustain and threaten our existence. But that is a story for another time. For now, in your small village in 1349, all you know is that your brother has been given a second chance at life. His recovery brought a new sense of belief to the community. If a child could defeat this terrible disease, then perhaps humanity could too. As the weeks passed and winter approached, the plague began to wane, not due to human intervention, but due to the natural cycle of the disease. Fleas are less active in cold weather, and the rat population also declined. For a short time, there was hope that the worst was over. But the Black Death was not finished. It was only retreating, to return with the warmth of spring, seeking new victims among those who had survived the first onslaught. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, successive waves of the plague would sweep across Europe. When the final wave of devastation finally subsided, the world that emerged from the catastrophe was fundamentally changed. Imagine walking through your village in the year 1352. The silence is different. Not the peaceful silence of an early morning, but the silence of emptiness. Your village, which once had about 200 people, now has fewer than 100. Nearly half of the thatched cottages stand empty, their doors swinging in the wind, their thatched roofs beginning to rot. The once carefully tended gardens are now overgrown with weeds. In the fields surrounding the village, the change is even more pronounced. Before the plague, every arable piece of land was used, even the barren plots on the hillsides. Population pressure had forced people to make the most of the land to feed their growing families. Now, with half the mouths to feed gone, land was suddenly abundant. The survivors abandoned the least fertile fields altogether, concentrating their efforts on the best, most fertile land in the valley. This simple change had a surprising result. Crop yields per person increased significantly. Where a peasant family had previously struggled to produce enough food, they now often harvested a surplus. This newfound abundance led to changes in diet. Before the plague, most peasants lived mainly on grain, bread, porridge, and ale. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions. Now, with surplus land, many converted grain fields into pastures for livestock. Meat, cheese, and butter appeared more frequently on humble dining tables. Archaeologists studying skeletons from this period have noted a significant improvement in the health and average height of the population after the plague, a testament to better nutrition. For the survivors, it was a small but tangible compensation for the unimaginable loss they had endured. But the most profound change was not in the land or the food, but in the value of human labor. The massive population decline created a severe labor shortage across Europe. The fields still needed to be plowed. The crops still needed to be harvested. Cloth still needed to be woven. Buildings still needed to be repaired. But there simply weren't enough people to do all the work. For the surviving peasants and artisans, this new reality gave them unprecedented bargaining power. Consider your father's case. Before the plague, he was a tenant, working hard to pay rent to the Lord. Now, the Lord's steward comes to him with an offer. The Lord needs someone to repair the roof of the manor house, which was damaged in a storm. With so many carpenters in the region dead, your father is one of the few left with the necessary skills. He was able to demand a wage 3 times higher than before, and the steward had to reluctantly agree. Similarly, the farm laborers who worked the Lord's fields could now demand higher wages or better working conditions. If the Lord refused, they could simply leave, knowing that neighboring manors were also desperate for workers and willing to make better offers. For the serfs, who were legally bound to the land, the plague offered an unexpected path to freedom. Many lords, in a desperate attempt to keep their fields cultivated, offered to free the serfs who were willing to stay and work. Others found that they could simply run away. With the social chaos and the authorities' own manpower shortage, catching runaway serfs became nearly impossible. Thousands left the manors where their families had been bound for generations, moving to towns or other lands in search of a better life. The system of serfdom, the foundation of feudal society for centuries, began to crack and crumble. These rapid changes deeply alarmed the nobility and the ruling classes. They saw the traditional social order, which had guaranteed their position and wealth, being threatened. They complained that the peasants had become lazy and arrogant, that they demanded exorbitant wages and refused to work unless their conditions were met. They were horrified to see common laborers wearing finer clothes and eating heartier meals, things that were previously reserved for the elite. Across Europe, governments tried to intervene to stop this tide of change. They enacted laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to force laborers to accept the old working conditions. In England, the government issued the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These laws set maximum wages for different types of jobs and punished both employers who paid more and workers who demanded more. France, Spain, and other countries enacted similar legislation. However, these efforts largely failed. The laws of economics were simply stronger than royal decrees. The labor shortage was too severe. Enforcing these laws proved nearly impossible, especially in rural areas. Lords and landowners, though theoretically in favor of wage controls, were often the first to break them secretly to attract scarce workers. Laborers also developed creative ways to circumvent the laws. A carpenter might agree to work for the official legal wage, but receive an additional gift of food, clothing, or free lodging. The tension between an increasingly confident working class and a nobility trying to cling to the past would simmer for decades, eventually erupting into peasant revolts across Europe. The devastation of the Black Death not only shook the economic and social structures, but also the ideological foundation of the medieval world, the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Church had been the center of life, providing spiritual comfort, a moral framework, and the promise of eternal salvation. But in the face of a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, the Church's power and prestige were severely damaged. Many people began to ask difficult questions. If the plague was God's punishment, why did it strike the devout and the sinful alike? Why did monks and nuns, who had dedicated their lives to God, die at such a high rate, even higher than the general populace? Furthermore, the behavior of some clergy during the pandemic eroded public trust. Many priests and bishops fled the affected cities and parishes, abandoning their flocks in their time of greatest need. Those who stayed and bravely performed their duties, like Father Thomas in your village, were often the first to die, leaving their positions vacant. To fill these gaps, the Church was forced to ordain men with little training and questionable morals, lowering the quality and prestige of the clergy. People began to feel that the Church had failed to protect them, both physically and spiritually. The prayers, processions, and rituals seemed to have no effect in stopping the spread of the disease. This disillusionment led to the rise of new religious movements outside the control of the mainstream Church. The flagellant movement, the self-floggers, attracted thousands of followers, but they often criticized the wealth and corruption of the Church and were eventually condemned as heretical by the Pope. More personal forms of piety also became popular. People began to seek a more direct relationship with God, without the need for the mediation of a clerical hierarchy they no longer fully trusted. This spirit of skepticism and questioning, sown in the years of the plague, would create fertile ground for future religious reform movements, culminating in the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. While the old institutions were crumbling, new opportunities arose for the survivors. In the towns and cities, where the death rate was particularly high, the labor shortage was even more severe than in the countryside. Housing, previously scarce and expensive, suddenly became plentiful and affordable. Young apprentices found themselves promoted to the position of master craftsmen years earlier than normal, as the craft guilds lost many of their senior members. The guilds, which were conservative and exclusive organizations, were forced to relax their rules to attract new members and stay in business. Women, who were traditionally excluded from most professions, also found new doors opening for them. With so many men dead, women often had to take over the family businesses, shops, workshops, and even large trading operations. Widows, instead of remarrying quickly as they had before, were now more likely to maintain their economic independence. Although these opportunities for women would gradually narrow as the population recovered, for several generations after the plague, women in many parts of Europe enjoyed a greater degree of economic and social freedom than before. The accumulation of wealth also changed. With so many people dying without direct heirs, property was often transferred to distant relatives or even to people with no blood ties. Some ordinary people became wealthy overnight. This shuffling of property blurred the traditional social boundaries. A new middle class, consisting of merchants, lawyers, and wealthy landowners, began to emerge, challenging the dominance of the hereditary nobility. They had money, but no status, and they yearned for recognition, displaying their wealth through patronage of the arts, building magnificent houses, and educating their children. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Black Death was the change in mindset, in how people viewed the world and their place in it. The experience of surviving a catastrophe that killed half the people around you left an indelible psychological mark. On the one hand, it created an obsession with death. The art and literature of the period are filled with macabre imagery, dances of death, where skeletons lead people from all walks of life, from the Pope and Emperor to the peasant to the grave, reminders of the transience of life, memento mori. But on the other hand, facing the fragility of life also made many people appreciate it more. The survivors, perhaps aware that life could end at any moment, embraced worldly pleasures with a new enthusiasm. They spent more freely, wore more colorful clothes, and enjoyed better meals. One chronicler wrote, "And those who were left after the plague gave themselves up to pleasures, taverns, games, and dice, and they plunged into a dissolute life." This was not mere debauchery, but an understandable psychological reaction to a collective trauma. If you could die tomorrow, why not live for today? More importantly, the plague shook the belief in the immutability of tradition. When half the population died, when social structures collapsed and were rebuilt in new forms, when once unquestionable authorities proved helpless, the idea that the world must always remain as it was lost its power, people began to realize that change was possible. They could imagine different ways of organizing work, of distributing wealth, of structuring power. This expansion of the imaginable was one of the most important legacies of the Black Death, setting the stage for the profound transformations of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and ultimately the birth of the modern world. The tension between an increasingly confident working class and a nobility trying to cling to their old power and privileges simmered for decades after the first outbreak of the plague. The laws controlling wages and restricting the movement of peasants, though largely ineffective, remained a source of deep resentment. The workers felt that they had survived a terrible catastrophe and deserved to enjoy the fruits of their labor in a new world where their skills were more valuable than ever. The nobility, in contrast, felt that the natural order of society was being turned upside down, and they had the right to maintain their status and wealth at all costs. In England, the situation became particularly tense in the late 14th century. The long and costly Hundred Years' War with France led the government to impose increasingly heavy taxes on the populace. In 1377, 1379, and again in 1380, the government imposed a poll tax levied on every adult regardless of their income. For the poor peasants and artisans, this tax was an unbearable burden. It was seen as grossly unfair, an attempt by the wealthy ruling class to shift the financial burden of the war onto the shoulders of those least able to pay. The poll tax of 1380 was the last straw. In May 1381, when royal tax officials arrived in the village of Fobbing in Essex to investigate why the people there had not paid their taxes, they were attacked and driven away by the villagers. This incident ignited a fire of rebellion that spread rapidly throughout southeastern England. Thousands of common people, peasants, artisans, and even some lower-ranking clergy took up arms, attacking the manners of the nobility, burning debt records and court rolls, and killing royal officials and lords whom they hated. The peasants' revolt in England had begun. The revolt quickly found its leaders. A man named Wat Tyler, a Tyler from Kent, emerged as a talented and charismatic military leader. He gathered a huge peasant army and began to march on London. With him was Jack Straw, another leader from Essex, and perhaps the most influential ideological figure of the revolt, a radical priest named John Ball. John Ball had been imprisoned multiple times for his sermons, in which he criticized the wealth of the church and called for an egalitarian society. John Ball's most famous sermon, said to have been delivered to a large crowd of rebels at Blackheath, just outside London, captured the revolutionary spirit of the moment. He posed a simple but powerful question. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? With this question, he challenged the entire foundation of feudal society. He argued that from the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, all people were created equal. The division between noble and commoner, between master and servant, was not ordained by God, but was the result of the unjust oppression of wicked men. He called on the rebels to cast off the yoke of bondage and establish a society where all things were held in common, with no serfs or nobles. These radical ideas, fueled by decades of economic grievances and the newfound confidence of the working class after the plague, inspired the rebels. They were not simply protesting an unjust tax. They were demanding a fundamental change in the structure of society. They believed they were fighting for a more just world, a world that better reflected the original teachings of Christianity. When the peasant army marched on London in June 1381, they carried not only crude weapons, but also a vision of a new social order. When the rebels arrived in London, the city fell into chaos. Many of the common people of London sympathized with them and opened the city gates. The rebels attacked the symbols of power and oppression. They burned the Savoy Palace, the magnificent residence of John of Gaunt, the king's powerful uncle. They stormed the Tower of London, dragged out and beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also the Chancellor and the Treasurer. The young king, Richard II, only 14 years old, was forced to retreat to safety. The king agreed to meet the leaders of the revolt at Mile End. Here, Wat Tyler presented their demands: the end of serfdom, freedom of trade for all, and a pardon for all who had participated in the revolt. The king, in an attempt to buy time, agreed to most of these demands. Many of the rebels, believing they had won, began to disperse and return home. But Wat Tyler and a core group remained, not fully trusting the king's promise and wanting further concessions. The second meeting took place at Smithfield. During this tense confrontation, an argument broke out. The mayor of London, William Walworth, drew his sword and stabbed Wat Tyler. One of the king's squires then finished him off. The death of their leader left the rebels shocked and disoriented. The young King Richard II bravely rode out before the panicked crowd, declaring, "I am your king, I will be your leader," and promised to meet their demands if they dispersed peacefully. Deceived by the king's promise, the remaining rebels withdrew. Soon after, the authorities gathered their forces and carried out a brutal crackdown. John Ball and the other leaders were captured and executed. The peasants' revolt was crushed in blood. Although the revolt failed militarily and its demands were immediately rejected, it left a lasting legacy. It showed the ruling class the depth of popular discontent and the potential power of an organized working class. The nobility and the government became more cautious about imposing heavy taxes and trying to enforce labor laws too harshly. The poll tax was never imposed again in England in the same way. More importantly, although serfdom was not immediately abolished by decree, its decline was accelerated. The lords, fearing another revolt, became increasingly willing to commute the labor services of their serfs into cash rents and to grant them more personal freedoms. Within a generation of the revolt, serfdom had all but disappeared in England. The revolt may have lost the battle, but it contributed to winning the long war against feudalism. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, as well as similar uprisings in France, the Jacquerie, 1358, and elsewhere in Europe, were a direct expression of the changed world after the Black Death. They were the voice of ordinary people who had survived an unimaginable catastrophe and were no longer willing to accept their place in a social order they considered unjust and oppressive. The rebels may have been defeated, but their spirit of defiance and their aspiration for a better life would continue to shape the development of European society for centuries to come. The consequences of the Black Death were not just economic, social, or political. They seeped into the deeper aspects of the human experience, how people felt about time, about life, and about themselves. Before the plague, life was measured by natural cycles, the changing of the seasons, the festivals of the church, and the succession of generations in a slow, predictable rhythm. Time was cyclical, but the plague broke that cycle abruptly and brutally. It showed that life could be cut short unexpectedly, that the future was uncertain. This new awareness of the fragility of life led to a change in how people used their time. There was a new urgency, a desire to make the most of one's time on Earth. This was reflected in the proliferation of mechanical clocks in cities. Previously, time was measured relatively by sundials or church bells. The mechanical clock, with its ability to divide the day into precise hours and minutes, brought a new, more linear view of time. Time was no longer an endless cycle, but a finite resource to be measured, managed, and used efficiently. The motto, Tempus Fugit, time flies, became popular. This focus on earthly life was also reflected in a change of values. While the pre-plague medieval worldview emphasized preparing for the afterlife, the post-plague worldview paid more attention to experiences and achievements in this life. This did not mean that people abandoned their faith, but there was a subtle shift in the balance. The newly wealthy merchants and artisans wanted to leave a tangible legacy in the world. They funded the construction of chapels, commissioned works of art, and established charities in their names. There was a new confidence in human ability to shape one's own world, a spirit that would be the foundation of Renaissance humanism. The demographic shock of the plague also inadvertently spurred the spread of knowledge. With so many educated clergy and scribes dead, the production of handwritten manuscripts became extremely slow and expensive. At the same time, the rise of a literate middle class created a growing demand for books. This combination of scarce supply and increasing demand created strong economic pressure to find a faster and cheaper method of producing books. The answer came in the mid-15th century with the invention of Johannes Gutenberg, the printing press with movable metal type. Although printing technology had existed in other forms, Gutenberg's invention allowed for the mass production of books at a speed and cost that was previously unimaginable. The first mass-produced book was the Bible, but soon the printing press was used to produce all sorts of works: classical Greek and Roman texts, scientific treatises, political pamphlets, and literary works in vernacular languages. This printing revolution changed the world. It broke the monopoly on knowledge held by the church and the elite. Ideas could spread faster and farther than ever before. A craftsman in London could read the same book as a merchant in Venice. The religious debates of the Reformation were fueled by the wide dissemination of the writings of Martin Luther and other reformers. The scientific revolution was built on the ability of scientists to share their discoveries and theories with an international community. Although the Black Death did not directly cause the invention of the printing press, it created the economic and social conditions that made such an invention necessary and profoundly impactful. The echoes of the Black Death still linger in our language and culture today, often in ways we don't recognize. The word quarantine, which we've used so much in recent pandemics, comes directly from the Venetian practice during plague outbreaks. Ships arriving from affected areas were required to anchor offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, before being allowed to dock. Even seemingly innocent nursery rhymes can carry faint memories of the plague. The song "Ring Around the Rosie" is often thought to be a description of the plague's symptoms. Ring around the rosy may refer to the red, ring-shaped rashes on the skin. A pocket full of posies refers to the fragrant herbs people carried to ward off the bad air. Ashes, ashes may refer to the mass cremation of bodies. And we all fall down is a clear reference to death. Although folklorists debate the exact origin of this rhyme, its connection to the plague remains part of popular lore, an example of how collective trauma can be encoded in culture in unexpected ways. The cultural legacy of the plague can also be seen in the changing of stories and legends. Stories of the apocalypse, of God's judgment, and of omens became popular. At the same time, there were also stories of miraculous survival, of mysterious healers, and of communities that overcame the ordeal together. These stories, retold over generations, helped people process and understand an event that was beyond normal comprehension. They became part of a shared cultural treasury, shaping how future generations would think about disaster, survival, and human resilience. Now, let us let our minds drift forward through time, to another time and another place, but still in the long shadow of the plague. Nearly 300 years have passed since the first devastating waves of the Black Death. It is now the summer of 1665, and we are in Ayam, a small and beautiful lead mining village nestled in the hills of Derbyshire, England. The plague, though no longer a pan-European pandemic, still returned periodically in local outbreaks. This time, it was ravaging London in an event that would become known as the Great Plague of London. But in Ayam, far from the chaos of the capital, life went on peacefully. The village had about 800 inhabitants, a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, and families had lived for generations. They worked in the lead mines, farmed small plots of land, and gathered at the parish church of St. Lawrence every Sunday. They felt safe in their isolation, believing that the plague was a problem of the big city, that it could not possibly reach their remote village. But they were wrong. Fate had other plans, a plan that would test their courage and write the name of this small village into history forever. In late August, a package arrived in Ayam, sent from London to the village tailor, Alexander Hadfield. It contained a bundle of damp cloth. His assistant, George Vickers, opened the package and hung the cloth by the fire to dry. He had no idea that hidden in the folds of the cloth were fleas carrying a deadly cargo, the Yersinia pestis bacteria. Within a few days, George Vickers fell ill with the familiar horrific symptoms. He died on September 7, 1665. The plague had come to Ayam. After Vickers' death, the plague began to spread slowly, but surely, through the village. By the end of October, another 28 villagers had died. Panic began to set in. The natural reaction, as in London and elsewhere, was to flee. Those who could afford it began to prepare to leave the village, seeking refuge in the surrounding countryside until the danger had passed. Had they done so, they would have almost certainly carried the plague with them, spreading it to neighboring towns and villages like Sheffield and Manchester. It was at this critical moment that two men stepped forward with an extraordinary proposal. William Mompesson, the newly appointed rector of the village, and Thomas Stanley, the previous Puritan rector, put aside their religious differences to appeal to the villagers together. They proposed something unimaginable, that the entire village would voluntarily quarantine itself. No one would be allowed to leave. No one would be allowed to enter. They would contain the plague within their own boundaries, accepting that many of them would die, in order to save countless others in the surrounding communities. It was an astonishing request, a call for collective sacrifice on an incredible scale. Yet, after much discussion and prayer, the villagers of Ayam agreed. They drew a circle of boundary stones around the village, a sanitary cordon that no resident would cross. The Earl of Devonshire, from nearby Chatsworth House, promised to leave food and supplies at these stones. Money to pay for the supplies was placed in holes in the stones filled with vinegar, as it was believed that vinegar could disinfect the coins. By an act of collective will, the village of Ayam sealed itself off from the outside world to face their enemy alone. What followed over the next 14 months was a story of unimaginable suffering and courage. The plague ravaged the isolated village. The death rate soared during the hot summer months of 1666. At times, people died every day. Entire families were wiped out. The churchyard quickly filled, and people had to start burying their loved ones in their gardens and in the fields. Amidst this tragedy, personal stories of resilience emerged. A woman named Elizabeth Hancock lost her husband and 6 children in just 8 days. With no one daring to come near to help, she dragged each body herself to a field near her home and buried them. Incredibly, despite direct contact with the bodies, Elizabeth Hancock never contracted the disease. She was one of the lucky survivors, perhaps carrying a genetic protection. Rector Mompesson, who had proposed the quarantine, paid a terrible personal price. His wife, Catherine, who had stayed by his side, contracted the disease and died in August 1666. Though heartbroken with grief, Mompesson continued to serve his community. He moved the church services outdoors to a natural amphitheater called Cucklet Dell, where people could stand far apart from each other, an early form of social distancing, to reduce the risk of infection. Even in the darkest hours, the community tried to maintain their faith and their solidarity. In the grim isolation of Ayam, personal lives continued, bringing both love and tragedy. One of the most moving stories is that of Emmett Siddall and Roland Torre, a young couple in love. Emmett lived in the village of Ayam, while Roland lived in a neighboring village. When the quarantine was imposed, they were suddenly separated. Unwilling to lose contact completely, they arranged to meet at a safe distance at a place called Cucklet Dell. They would stand on opposite sides of a small stream, close enough to see and talk to each other, but far enough to avoid any risk of infection. These brief meetings were their only source of comfort during the early months of the quarantine. But as the spring of 1666 arrived, and the plague began to rage at its fiercest, Emmett stopped coming to their meeting place. Roland continued to go there every day, calling her name in vain. He did not know that Emmett had become one of the plague's victims in April. Only after the quarantine was finally lifted did he learn the heartbreaking truth. Their story, a love cut short by disease but marked by devotion, has become one of Ayam's most enduring legends, a symbol of the personal tragedies that played out behind the great collective decision. Another, stranger story is that of Margaret Blackwell. She fell gravely ill with the symptoms of the plague and was left for dead by her family. Delirious with thirst, she stumbled into the kitchen and drank a large quantity of rendered bacon fat, which she mistook for milk. To everyone's astonishment, Margaret recovered. For centuries, the villagers would tell the story of how bacon fat had cured the plague. The truth was probably more complex. She may have had a natural resistance to the disease, but the legend shows how desperate people were to find any remedy, any glimmer of hope in the fight against death. As the death toll rose, burial became a pressing problem. A man named Marshall Howe, who had survived the loss of his wife and son, took on this grim task. He was not a selfless hero. It is said that he took the job for the money, and even looted the homes of the dead before burying them. Yet, his story contains a medical mystery. He handled hundreds of infected bodies, entering houses that no one else dared to approach. By all logic, he should have been one of the first to die. Yet, Marshall Howe survived the entire outbreak without a single symptom. Like Elizabeth Hancock, he seemed to be completely immune to the disease. Again, modern science suggests that he likely carried 2 copies of the CCR5 Delta 32 gene mutation, giving him almost absolute protection. To the villagers of Ayam, his survival was a mystery, perhaps proof that God worked in inscrutable ways, or perhaps just blind luck. Whatever the reason, his work, whatever its motivation, was an essential service that saved the village from an even worse situation, with unburied bodies. The existence of immune survivors like Elizabeth Hancock and Marshall Howe, alongside the vulnerable, created a complex picture of life and death in the village. It was not simply a disaster that wiped out everything in its path. It was a ruthless process of selection, sparing some and taking others based on invisible factors that no one at the time could understand. Each survivor carried with them a story of luck, resilience, or a biological quirk that allowed them to see the dawn again. When the plague finally ended in November 1666, it had raged in Ayam for 14 months. Of the original population of about 800, 260 had died. The mortality rate was much higher than the average for the Great Plague of London. Entire family lines were wiped out. The village was devastated, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The plague had been contained within the boundaries of Ayam. The surrounding communities, including the growing major cities, were spared the devastation. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of lives were saved by the courageous decision of one small village. In the quiet aftermath, the survivors began the long and painful process of rebuilding their lives and their community. They could not have known the legacy they had created. They could not have imagined that 3.5 centuries later, their story would still be told as an extraordinary example of courage and self-sacrifice for the common good. They could not have known that future scientists would study their descendants to learn about the genetics of disease resistance. They only knew that they had survived an unimaginable ordeal, and now they had to find a way to go on living. The story of Ayam is not just a footnote in the history of the plague. It is a powerful testament to the human capacity to make difficult moral choices in the face of disaster. Those villagers chose the welfare of strangers over their own safety. They put the common good above individual survival. In a world that often prioritizes self-interest, their actions remain a source of inspiration and a reminder of the best that humanity can achieve, even in the darkest of times. As we drift into the deeper levels of sleep, let us look at the big picture one more time. The Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks were not just historical tragedies. They were powerful agents of change, events that reshaped the Western world in ways that still affect us today. Their legacy can be found in our DNA, in our social structures, in our economic systems, and even in how we face our own crises. The biological legacy, as we have seen, is one of the most remarkable. The ruthless natural selection of the plague increased the frequency of protective genes like CCR5 Delta 32 in European populations, a legacy that unexpectedly provided benefits in the fight against HIV/AIDS centuries later. It may also have shaped our immune systems in other ways, possibly contributing to both its strengths and its weaknesses. History is not just written in books, it is also etched in our genome. The economic and social legacy is no less profound. The decline of serfdom in Western Europe, the rise of a working class with higher wages and more freedoms, the emergence of a new middle class. All of these have their roots in the sudden demographic shift caused by the plague. The world was no longer a place where one's status was determined entirely by birth. Opportunity, though still limited, began to open up for those with skill, ambition, and luck. The foundations for capitalism and modern societies were laid in the chaos of the post-plague world. The story of the Black Death also offers valuable lessons for our own time. It shows how vulnerable societies are to infectious diseases and how quickly pandemics can spread in a connected world. It also shows the importance of public health measures. The concepts of quarantine, social distancing, and the need for individual sacrifice for the common good are not new inventions. They are lessons written in the blood and tears of past generations. Their struggle to understand an invisible disease also mirrors our own challenges in facing new threats. The spread of misinformation, the search for scapegoats, the tension between individual liberty and community responsibility. All of these have echoes in history. But history also shows the human capacity to learn and adapt. From initial efforts based on superstition, societies gradually developed more effective responses to epidemics, laying the groundwork for modern medicine and public health. Perhaps the most important lesson is about human resilience. The Black Death was one of the worst disasters ever to befall humanity. It caused suffering and loss on an almost incomprehensible scale. Yet, humanity did not collapse. The survivors did not surrender to despair. They mourned the dead, and then they began to rebuild. They created new families, new communities, and ultimately, a new world from the ashes. Their story is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit, to endure, to adapt, and to find hope even in the darkest of circumstances. Now, as our story comes to an end, let these final images gently carry you into sleep. Imagine once again the medieval village we visited, but now many years later. The empty houses are inhabited again. The fields are cultivated once more. The laughter of children rings out again in the village streets. The survivors, now older, carry with them the memories of a dark time, but they also carry the strength and wisdom gained from having overcome it. They did not know that their story would be retold centuries later, that their choices and sacrifices would continue to have meaning. They simply lived their lives, facing the challenges that fate had set before them with courage and perseverance. And in doing so, they became part of a larger story, the story of humanity's unending survival and progress. You are a part of that story. Their legacy, both biological and cultural, still flows in the veins of our world. As you sink deeper into sleep, feel that connection. Feel the strength of resilience that has been passed down through countless generations. Let the peace of history past envelop you. All the worries of today are small compared to the challenges that humanity has overcome. And just as the survivors of the Black Death found peace after the storm, you too can find rest and restoration in a deep and peaceful sleep tonight. And so, our journey through one of the darkest and most transformative chapters of history has come to an end. We have walked the paths of a long-vanished world, felt its rhythm of life, shared the fears and hopes of the people who lived and died there. We've seen a society pushed to the brink of collapse, only to find the strength to rise again, to rebuild, and to change profoundly. The story of the Black Death is not just a story of disease and death. It is a story of economics, of the shift in power from land to labor. It is a story of society, of the fracturing of rigid hierarchies and the rise of new opportunities. It is a story of faith, of doubt, and the search for new meaning. And above all, it is a story of people, of our fragility, but also of our incredible resilience. Now, let these stories dissolve into the background of your mind, like dreams upon waking. Hold on to the feeling of resilience, of the strength that has helped humanity overcome unimaginable challenges. That strength is also within you. As you drift away, deeper and deeper into sleep, know that you are resting. You are restoring. The noise of the outside world fades away. All that remains is the stillness of the night and the steady rhythm of your own breath. Every exhale is a letting go of thoughts, of worries, of the images from the story we just told. Every inhale is a receiving the peace, the quiet, and the restoration of a deep sleep. There's nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, only to be here, right now, in the comfort and safety of your bed. Let the soft darkness of sleep envelop you like a warm blanket. Sleep well, and we'll meet again on another historical journey.